The gavel detonated like thunder, and the oak shivered, and Ava Cole felt her ribs answer in tremors as the gallery gasped. Judge Miriam Locke said, "Order." The word cracked again, but order fled like smoke. Nolan Price swallowed on the stand and his eyes broke, and he blurted a truth that slashed the air. Nolan Price said, "I bought the footage to disappear." The reporter's pen froze as if stabbed into time, and the prosecutor's smile died mid-breath. Diane Mercer said, "Repeat that." Ethan Vale's hand caged Ava's wrist, gentle iron, and her pulse rioted against it. Ava said, "Tell them who took your money." The jury leaned as one body, and fear ran electric down the rail. "Nolan Price," said Detective Rooker, made it easy. Detective Carl Rooker flinched, then squared his jaw like a door slammed hard. Judge Miriam Locke said, "Counselors approach," and the floor seemed to tilt under every foot. Ava tasted copper, and the cameras drank her panic, and her name felt like a brand. She said, "I didn't need a fixer," but the words landed like broken glass. Somewhere in the back, the town's gossip hissed into a phone, and the case changed shape in a single breath. The recess hit like a mercy that hurt, and Ava stood in the shadow of a pillar while thunder braided the morning into knots. Ethan Vale said, "You breathe, and you do not volunteer." The hallway smelled of wet wool and old dust, and cameras waited like open mouths. Diane Mercer passed with a rain-bright smile that never reached her eyes. Diane Mercer said, "Cleanup is an art." Ava remembered applause she used to ride like a tide, and her stomach tightened against the memory. Trent Bishop raised his phone and held it like a mirror that cut. Trent Bishop said, "America wants your confession, Avia." She pictured her daughter at 17, fierce and silent, and dread curled low like a fuse. Ava said, "She won't watch this." Ethan's hand hovered, ready to be anchor or shield, and he let it fall to her side without touching. The elevator dinged like a verdict that refused to wait, and the doors opened on a sheriff's stare. Judge Miriam Locke said from behind, "Counselor, your witness is not to be hunted," and the words held the hallway still. Ava pulled air into a chest that burned, and decided not to break. The conference room hummed with the low war of vents and whispers, and the city dripped against the windows like a metronome for dread. Ethan laid files in a fan and stabbed a fingertip at a missing link. Ethan Vale said, "If the footage vanished, the chain speaks louder." Riley Hart stepped in with hair wet and a stare that held secrets like knives. Riley Hart said, "I can point without bleeding if you pay in protection." Ava hated bargaining with ghosts, and she felt the show host in her want to charm the storm. She killed it fast with a breath that tasted like metal. Ava said, "What do you want, saved investigator?" Riley flicked a damp page onto the table and kept her voice a whisper. Riley Hart said, "A ledger called Red, and a life not mine." Ethan glanced at the door, as if ears grew there in the wood. Ethan Vale said, "Names." Riley shook her head once and smiled like a trap. Riley Hart said, "Ask the detective how cheap the night was." The rain hammered hard, and the clock seemed to skid. Court resumed with a hush that felt rehearsed, and yet the room carried new fractures like hairline cracks in glass. Judge Miriam Locke said, "Mr. Price, you will answer precisely." Nolan's hands trembled, but his voice steadied with the greed of absolution. Nolan Price said, "I paid for silence, not truth." Diane Mercer stepped into the beam of everyone's eyes and trimmed her tone to silk. Diane Mercer said, and the defendant ordered this silence. Ava lifted her chin and found the camera that wanted her ruin. Ava said, "I never bought what I could earn." Ethan Vale rose slow, eyes calm like deep water, where sharp things hide. Ethan Vale said, "Detective Rooker, where is the receipt for your clean conscience?" Carl Rooker's nostrils flared, and a flush crawled his neck like guilt growing a spine. Carl Rooker said, "I did my job by the book." Ethan smiled like a surgeon about to cut. Ethan Vale said, "Then let us read your edition." The gallery leaned forward, and the storm gave a far growl that felt like an omen with a badge. The cross cut slow and deliberate, and pages turned like quiet threats, while the court stenographer's keys clicked a funeral rhythm. Ethan Vale said, "Detective, who signed your evidence locker log on June 9. Carl Rooker said, "No anomalies." Ethan slid a photocopy across with a ghost of a smile. Ethan Vale said, "This signature is yours, and yet you were off duty." A murmur rippled, and the judge's eyes flashed flint. Judge Miriam Locke said, "Counsel, mind the line." Ava felt heat at her spine and saw Riley in the last row, motionless as a warning. Riley Hart said, "Ask about Red," though only Ava's lips read it. The gallery's buzz thickened like weather before hail. Diane Mercer said, "Defense is dancing." Ethan did not look away from the detective, and the paper gleamed like a blade. Ava said, "If this is the dance, let the truth lead." Somewhere a phone vibrated against a purse like a trapped insect, and the storm gathered itself to speak again. The storm bullied the windows while Ethan spread exhibits like cards meant to wound, and the gallery leaned to the scent of paper and fear. "Ethan Vale," said detective, "describe the route of Exhibit 12 from street to vault." Carl Rooker said, "Collected, sealed, logged, and secured." The stenographer's keys tapped a hymn that always ended in blame, and Ava's pulse hitched to the rhythm. Ethan Vale said, "Who signed the interim lock check on June 9th? Carl Rooker said, "I did." Ethan slid the photocopy that gleamed like a scalpel. Ethan Vale said, "You were off duty and across town at a bar named Harbor." Diane Mercer rose as if pulled by wire. Diane Mercer said, moved to strike as argumentative. Judge Miriam Locke said, "Overruled, answer the question." Carl Rooker said, "I verified by phone." Ethan Vale said, "Policy forbids remote verification." A hush pooled, and Riley Hart in the last row didn't blink. Ava said, "Ask him about Red," and the word burned a secret path through her teeth. Ethan Vale said, "Detective, what is the red ledger attached to your night shift audits?" The rain answered first, and then Rooker's silence answered louder. Chambers felt small enough to force truth out of breath, and the rain made a drum out of the window's skin. Judge Miriam Locke said, "Counselors, I want daylight on this ledger." Diane Mercer said, "Defense is chasing rumors to poison the jury." Ethan Vale said, "The chain is a ladder, and this rung is rotten." Ava stood with hands clasped and memories of applause curdling into static. She pictured her daughter's last message, a single heart sent before silence learned her number. Ava said, "The leak is killing us faster than any verdict." Diane Mercer smiled like a door with no handle. Diane Mercer said, "A leak only hurts the guilty." Judge Miriam Locke said, "Produce any ledger records by morning or risk sanctions." Ethan's jaw shifted as if he bit down on thunder. Ethan Vale said, "We will subpoena the Harbor Bar logs and the audit trail." The clock on the credenza sounded like a countdown no one admitted hearing, and the room exhaled in uneven fragments. Lunch recess bled into gray noon, and the courthouse steps steamed where drizzle met warm stone. Trent Bishop prowled with his phone raised like a net. Trent Bishop said, "Sources name a ledger cold red, and a detective with a tab." Ava kept her face still, while her stomach auditioned panic. Ethan Vale said no comment. A woman with a rain scarf whispered into the wind, and fed it to another mic. Luann Pike said, "The town knows when money smells wrong." Riley Hart slid beside a column with eyes that kept count of exits. Riley Hart said, "The bar's cameras died from selective lightning." Ava said, "Tell me what it costs to make them remember." Riley's mouth twitched into a warning that tasted like old smoke. Riley Hart said, "Protection, not payment, and you testify clean if I burn a bridge." Ethan's voice dropped into the space where resolve becomes risk. Ethan Vale said, "We do this on record or not at all." Sirens stitched the street and made the day feel like a wound that wanted company. The afternoon session began with a rumor that walked faster than truth, and phones vibrated like hornets in purses and pockets. Judge Miriam Locke said, All devices off or I clear the room. Diane Mercer said, the state moves to sequester due to defense-driven publicity. Ethan Vale said, the leak predates our questions and smells like a badge. Clerk Angela Ruiz typed a storm into the record without lifting her gaze. Ava felt the floor tilt as the bailiff collected screens like candy from scolded children. Marisol Drake kept her stare straight, and guilt flickered in a juror, 2 seats down like a bad bulb no one wants to own. Judge Miriam Locke said, the jury is sequestered as of now. Diane Mercer said, the state also moves to exclude the so-called red ledger. Ethan Vale said, excluding evidence is not the same as excluding embarrassment. The gallery hissed, and the gavel settled the air like a lid on boiling water. Night softened the courthouse into a ship at harbor, and the defense room glowed with maps of trouble taped to whiteboard glass. Riley placed a key on the table as if laying down a debt. Riley Hart said, Locker E17 keeps things that fear daylight. Ethan Vale said, if this is entrapment, it ends careers. Ava touched the metal and felt the cold part of courage wake. Ava said, I lost my good name on camera and never got a receipt. Riley leaned close enough for the truth to smell like rain and coffee. Riley Hart said, if red exists, it lives where Rooker hides his nights. Ethan paced a slow line that matched the hum of fluorescent ballast. Ethan Vale said, we move the court order or we do not move. Ava pictured her daughter's face framed by the blue of a phone she would not answer. Ava said, make the order, and I will stand in front of it. The storm finally thinned, and the city sighed like a witness changing its story. The morning cracked open with a sky, the color of verdict paper, flat and cold, and Ava stood in the defense corner like a shadow daring to move. Ethan Vale said today, we walk them straight into the red. Diane Mercer's eyes skimmed the jury like a scalpel, deciding where to cut. Diane Mercer said, prosecution calls Detective Carl Rooker. Rooker stepped to the stand with the posture of a man walking on ice he helped thin. Ethan Vale, said Detective, how many times did you access Locker E17 this year? Carl Rooker said 3. Ethan Vale said the logs show 6. The jury rustled, heads tilting in unison, and Ava felt the air shift toward her side. Judge Miriam Locke said, Detective, answer directly. Rooker said, 2 were routine, 1 was emergency, the rest were delegated. Ethan's tone tightened. Ethan Vale said, to whom? The pause was a crack where something dangerous might crawl out. Ava's breath snagged. The storm outside hadn't started yet, but inside, thunder had already chosen its side. The exhibits table bloomed with files like bruises, each stamped in red that meant more than evidence should. Ethan Vale said, Your Honor, Exhibit 34, Ledger, excerpt from Locker E17. Diane Mercer rose before the clerk could breathe. Diane Mercer said, Objection, no authentication. Judge Miriam Locke said, Overruled, if chain is established now. Ava's eyes locked on the page, columns of numbers, and names like a city's shadow population. Ethan Vale said, Detective Rooker, is this your handwriting in the margin? Carl Rooker said, It is. A murmur rippled the gallery, like wind shaking glass before it shatters. Ava leaned to Ethan and whispered, This breaks him. Ethan's mouth didn't move when he replied. Ethan Vale said, It breaks the case. Diane Mercer's pen tapped, sharp and fast, a war drum for one hand only. The jury's gaze grew heavy enough to bend air. The cross-examination carved the room into smaller and smaller corners until no one could hide. Ethan Vale said, These margin notes, what do they reference? Carl Rooker said, Internal shorthand. Ethan Vale said, Translation, payments received. Rooker's jaw flexed like it was chewing on a confession. Ava could feel the jurors counting the beats between questions and answers. Judge Miriam Locke said, Detective, answer plainly. Carl Rooker said, They could be payments. Diane Mercer said, Speculation. Ethan Vale said admission. The word hung like a blade just above its target. Riley Hart shifted in the gallery, her eyes fixed not on the detective, but on Ava. Riley Hart said, "He's about to fold," barely audible to herself. The bailiff's eyes narrowed, sensing movement that might not stay polite. The ledger lay open like an autopsy, no one wanted to watch but couldn't look away from. Ethan Vale said, entry dated June 9th. Amount matches payment to Nolan Price's account. Nolan Price's knuckles went pale in the second row. Diane Mercer said, "Your Honor, this is prejudicial." Judge Miriam Locke said admissible if relevance is established. Ava's mind flashed to the night she first met Nolan, the way he had leaned in with a smile built from leverage. Ethan Vale said relevance. Bribery to destroy footage exonerating my client. The gallery inhaled like one body tasting blood. Rooker's hand drifted to his lapel, as if to cover a badge that no longer shielded him. Ava said, "You can't sew a lie that big without loose threads." Her voice wasn't meant to carry, but it did. The judge called a recess that felt less like relief and more like pulling a plug from a live wire. In the hallway, Riley Hart's boots echoed a warning down the marble. Riley Hart said, "He'll run before the end of day." Ava said, "Then we cut him off." Ethan Vale stood by the water cooler, eyes on nothing visible. Ethan Vale said, "We have to lock Rooker in the record before he vanishes." Diane Mercer passed with her phone pressed close, voice low. Diane Mercer said, "Containment now." Ava caught sight of her reflection in the glass, eyes that no longer asked permission to survive. Outside, the clouds sagged heavy, and the courthouse doors looked smaller, as if bracing for something bigger than a trial. The courthouse air was colder than the morning outside, as if the walls had learned too many secrets to stay warm. Ethan Vale said, "Detective Rooker, your statement yesterday conflicts with the Harbor Bar logs." Diane Mercer said, "Objection, assumes facts not in evidence." Judge Miriam Locke said, "Overruled, proceed." Ava watched Rooker's jaw grind, each word dragged like a stone up a hill. Carl Rooker said, "I stopped by, yes, but not on official business." Ethan Vale said, "Yet you signed an official ledger that night." The gallery shifted like a restless tide, and Riley Hart's eyes cut toward Ava as if measuring the cost of what came next. Ava said, "Ask about the second set of keys." Ethan Vale said, "Detective, who else has access to locker E17? Rooker's pause became a spotlight none of them could dim. The ledger appeared again, heavier than paper, and Ethan's fingers rested on it like a priest on a confession. Ethan Vale said, "This entry marked RARD. What does it mean?" Rooker's eyes went to Diane before finding the floor. Carl Rooker said, "Internal designation." Ethan Vale said, "For what?" Silence swelled until the judge's voice broke it. Judge Miriam Locke said, "Detective, answer." Carl Rooker said, "Special handling." Ava's pulse kicked hard enough to hear in her ears. Diane Mercer said, "This is meaningless without context." Ethan Vale said, "Context is corruption." The jury inhaled in unison, and somewhere in the back, Nolan Price shifted like a man deciding whether to run or burn. The judge called for a brief sidebar, and the white noise machine hummed like a distant wasp. Diane Mercer said, "Your Honor, the defense is constructing a conspiracy from paperwork." Ethan Vale said, "Your Honor, the paperwork is a confession that learned to write." Judge Miriam Locke said, "Enough, both of you." Ava stared at the ledger left on the table, its edges curling slightly like something alive. Riley Hart caught her eye from the gallery and mouthed, "E17 tonight." Ava's breath locked, and for a heartbeat she was back on her studio stage, reading lines she didn't choose but knew would land. Afternoon, light slanted across the courtroom like a slow blade. Ethan Vale said, "Detective, can you confirm the chain of custody for Exhibit 12 remains unbroken?" Carl Rooker said, "It is intact." Ethan Vale said, "Then explain why two signatures on the same date belong to you." Rooker's jaw flexed, and his fingers tapped once on the rail. Diane Mercer said, "The witness has answered." Judge Miriam Locke said, "The witness will clarify." Carl Rooker said, "One was mine. One was delegated." Ethan Vale said, "Delegated to whom?" Silence again, but this time it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The recess spilled them into the hall where shadows outnumbered people. Riley Hart was already waiting, her jacket carrying the smell of rain from a storm not yet here. Riley Hart said, "Locker E17 tonight, before it vanishes." Ava said, "Court order first." Ethan Vale said, "If we wait for paper, we'll be reading an empty shelf." Diane Mercer passed at the far end, her eyes sharp enough to skin secrets. Ava felt the old showwoman's instinct rise. Time the reveal, own the room, leave no way out. She said, "Then we make our own paper." The night clung to the courthouse like it had a stake in the verdict, shadows thick as ink pooling in every doorway. Ethan Vale said, "We move now, before Rooker smells the wind changing." Ava's pulse was a drum in her ears as Riley Hart produced the key to locker E17 like a magician holding the final card. Riley Hart said, "This opens more than one door." Diane Mercer's voice carried from down the hall, clipped and urgent, speaking into her phone. Ava said, "She knows." Ethan Vale said, "Then we run faster." The elevator chimed sharp as a gunshot in the stillness. Riley Hart said, "Service stairwell, 2 flights down." Ava followed, her heels ringing out like challenges against the marble, each step tightening the thread between risk and ruin. The basement smelled of dust, metal, and secrets left to rust. Ethan Vale said, "Locker rows this way." Riley Hart's flashlight sliced the dark, landing on a row of dented steel doors. Ava touched the key, cold and heavy, like it had been waiting for her hand. Ava said, "Once it's open, there's no turning back." Riley Hart said, "Back was never an option." The lock turned with a sound that felt louder than thunder, and the door creaked inward. Inside, the red ledger sat on top of a battered evidence box like a crown on a coffin. Ethan Vale said, "Take pictures, don't touch." Ava's hand hovered anyway, the air around it thick with what it might cost. The click of the camera shutter was the only sound until footsteps echoed down the hall like a countdown. Riley Hart said, "We've got company." Ethan Vale snapped the locker shut, the metal clang masking his quick intake of breath. Ava said, "If it's Rooker, we're cornered." A shadow broke the light spill from the stairwell, tall and deliberate. Carl Rooker's voice slid through the dark. Carl Rooker said, "You shouldn't be here." Ethan Vale said, "Neither should you." The space between them felt like a fuse ready to burn both ends. Rooker stepped forward, his shoes whispering against the concrete. Carl Rooker said, "That ledger doesn't belong to you." Ava said, "Then who does it belong to? The people who paid or the ones who took?" His jaw worked as if words were caught between teeth. Ethan Vale said, "This is evidence of a crime, and you're in it up to your badge." Riley Hart edged closer to the stairwell, her eyes flicking to Ava. Riley Hart said, "We need to go, now." Rooker's hand twitched toward his coat pocket. Ava said, "If you're reaching for a gun, you'd better make it worth the last thing you do in uniform." The pause after was thick enough to drown in. They moved fast, the ledger images burning in Ethan's phone, the real book still locked away for now. Ava said, "We have enough to pin him." Riley Hart said, "Or enough to bury ourselves." The stairwell door groaned open, spilling them into the cool night air behind the courthouse. The city hummed distant and unaware, streetlights bending halos over wet asphalt. Ethan Vale said, "Tomorrow, we bring it into the record." Ava looked up at the courthouse windows, each one a dark square holding too many eyes. Ava said, "Tomorrow, they'll try to stop us before we even get to the bench." The rain began again, fine as breath on glass. The storm had turned the city into a stage of dripping asphalt and low thunder, and the courthouse loomed in the distance like it knew what they carried. Ethan Vale said, We need the judge to see the ledger photos first thing. Ava Cole said, and pray she doesn't seal them before they hit the record. Riley Hart's boots splashed through shallow puddles, her jaw set. Riley Hart said, Rooker's not sleeping tonight, he'll be tearing apart every excuse he has. Diane Mercer was already at the steps, umbrella in one hand, phone in the other, voice sharp as cut glass. Ethan Vale said, we go in separate, no chance to intercept all of us. The rain hissed against the stone like the courthouse itself was shushing them. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with whispers too low for the record, but loud enough to bend the air. Judge Miriam Locke said, counsel will hear arguments before admission. Ethan Vale rose, placing the printed ledger photos on the desk like evidence from a crime scene no one could bury. Diane Mercer said, Your Honor, this material is unlawfully obtained. Ava said, truth doesn't care how polite you are when you meet it. Judge Miriam Locke's gavel touched the block lightly, a warning more than a strike. Ethan Vale said, this proves Detective Rooker falsified logs to conceal payments. The gallery leaned forward, scenting blood in the water. The first ledger photo hit the overhead projector, red stamps bleeding under the glow. Ethan Vale said, note the matching amounts between Exhibit 12 and Nolan Price's account. Nolan Price shifted, eyes darting toward Rooker. Diane Mercer said, correlation is not proof. Ava whispered to Ethan, it's enough to tilt them. Judge Miriam Locke said, Mr. Rooker, respond. Carl Rooker's voice was tight, fraying at the edges. Carl Rooker said, those were operational disbursements. Ethan Vale said, to a known fixer during an active investigation. The silence after was the loudest moment of the morning. The cross-examination slid from fact to implication, like a blade finding bone. Ethan Vale said, who authorized these disbursements? Carl Rooker said, classified. Judge Miriam Locke said, nothing is classified in this courtroom. Rooker's jaw locked, and his silence felt like confession. Ava's hands clenched under the table, nails biting into her palms. Riley Hart in the back row mouthed, he's done. Diane Mercer leaned forward, tone silk over steel. Diane Mercer, said Detective, choose your next word carefully. The jury's eyes were a net with no holes. Recess came like a gasp the room had been holding. In the hall, Ava leaned against the wall, heartbeat still chasing the last exchange. Ethan Vale said if he cracks on record this afternoon it's over. Riley Hart said, or he pulls someone else down with him. Diane Mercer swept past, perfume and calculation trailing behind her. Ava said, she's already planning her salvage speech. Outside the window, the rain slowed, leaving the glass streaked like a map of escape routes. The air inside the courtroom felt stripped of oxygen, every breath sharpened to a blade. Judge Miriam Locke said, we will resume testimony. Ethan Vale rose, holding the ledger photos like a final card in a game already too bloody. Diane Mercer said, the state moves to strike all reference to Exhibit Red. Ava Cole said, strike the truth, you still bleed from it. Rooker shifted in the witness chair, the wood groaning under his weight. Ethan Vale, said Detective, confirm you authorized payments to Nolan Price during an active investigation. Carl Rooker's eyes darted toward the jury, then back to Ethan. Carl Rooker said, yes. The gallery gasped, the sound like a wave breaking in a cave. Ethan Vale said, and these payments were for the destruction of evidence connected to my client. Rooker's silence stretched, brittle and dangerous. Judge Miriam Locke said, answer the question. Carl Rooker said, it was done to protect the department. Ava whispered to herself, and kill the truth. Diane Mercer's knuckles whitened against the table as she adjusted her stance. The jury leaned forward, their expressions sharpened to points. Ethan Vale said no further questions. The gavel struck, but its sound felt muted, swallowed by the weight in the room. Closing arguments began with the air thick enough to drink. Diane Mercer said, do not let rumors dress themselves as proof. Ethan Vale stepped into the well, voice steady. Ethan Vale said, "Proof doesn't ask your permission, it simply is." Ava's chest ached as she watched the jury, her freedom measured in their eyes. Ethan Vale said, "This ledger is not a rumor, it is a signed confession inked by the hand, sworn to uphold the law." The gallery's murmur was a restless tide, pulled by the moon of the moment. The jury filed out, leaving the room hollow but heavy. Ava sat motionless, every heartbeat counting time she couldn't control. Ethan Vale said, "It's in their hands now." Riley Hart leaned in from the row behind. Riley Hart said, "And you've given them the knife to cut you free." Outside, rain tapped the windows, soft now, almost kind. Diane Mercer gathered her files with precise, quiet movements, as if already rewriting the loss into her next victory. Ava's gaze stayed fixed on the jury door, willing it to open with the right truth. The jury returned, and every sound vanished under the weight of what they carried. Judge Miriam Locke said, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson said, "We have." Ava's lungs refused air until the words came. "Not guilty." The gallery erupted, voices clashing like storm surf against stone. Ethan Vale's hand found her shoulder, grounding her in the chaos. Ava looked to Riley Hart, who gave the smallest nod, a silent acknowledgement of debts owed and choices made. Ava's eyes lifted to the high windows, the rain now gone, leaving only a pale wash of sunlight across the bench.